Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Byte Pod. My name is Eric Hamilton. I'm a program officer with New Borders, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. I want to introduce our speakers for today and just quickly go over what we're going to be discussing. Please welcome former Special Agent with Homeland Security Investigations and investigative subject matter expert Michael Ronayne.
Hello.
We have a senior Byte team member, Ann Reetho, and our special guest partner at Wiggin and Dana, David Hall. Before we move on to our speakers, I just want to talk a little bit about the Byte platform as a whole. Here at Byte, we do two things. We have a backend AI-based trade data platform with hundreds of millions of records that informs our customers' analysis and drives our compliance and risk management tools. We take the output of the AI model, consolidate the larger list of compliance data, and make it all available to the public through a very easy-to-use web app. The web app known as Byte offers a cost-effective toolbox for trade and transaction compliance. We provide a low-cost, efficient way for customers to mitigate their trade risk. Uh, Today, we're going to be focusing on intellectual property rights. We're going to be hearing from Mike about a recent enforcement action, as well as Ann to talk about what our data is showing related to the case. And then we'll have a larger discussion around IPR with David Hall. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Eric. So just to sort of shape or inform our discussion today, we're going to talk a little bit about a recent case of counterfeit Cisco networking equipment. In June, DOJ announced a guilty plea of owner Axoy, a Miami man, to charges of conspiracy to traffic in counterfeit goods, to commit mail fraud, and to commit wire fraud. Now, under the plea agreement, Axoy faces a sentence of between 4 and 6.5 years in prison. In terms of the scheme, Axway operated almost 20 companies in New Jersey and Florida, as well as multiple Amazon storefronts. These companies and the associated storefronts operated under the name Pro Network and were responsible for illegally importing counterfeit computer networking devices labeled with fake Cisco labels, packaging, and documentation to make them appear as new legitimate models. Now, these products had a retail value estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and Pro Network generated over $100 million in illegal revenue. These devices, which were imported from China and Hong Kong, were older or inferior products that counterfeiters modified to appear as new Cisco products and also added pirated software to circumvent license compliance. Now, in addition, these substandard products often cause damage to existing networks, which was critical because Pro Network's customers included hospitals, schools, and the US military. So as we will discuss, counterfeit goods entered into the commerce of the United States not only infringe upon the copyrights, patents, and trademarks of legitimate companies, but they can also pose a significant public safety risk or potentially even a national security risk if they enter into the supply chain of US military or law enforcement.
Thanks, Mike. I will now walk us through a little bit of what we found in our data. So, as Eric said, we have a back-end AI-based trade data analytic platform, and we reviewed the output of the data associated with Pro Network entities and identified 17 transactions involving two of the Pro Network entities. One of these transactions actually included an attention to Ron Owner Oksoy in the address line, and Ron Oksoy is one of the aliases identified in the DOJ press release that Mike just walked us through. Additional transactions were identified using other key identifying information, and product descriptions for some of these transactions included descriptions like machines for reception transmission of data and also networking equipment. One of these transactions included over 3,000 pieces of networking equipment. The suppliers identified by Byte have been listed on our Byte list, which is available through our web-based app and can be searched there and along with other entities associated with illicit trade. So we're not alleging wrongdoing by listing these entities on the Byte list, but we are saying that they've been associated with counterfeit supply chains. We do ongoing analysis like this month to month and continue to update the Byte list with other entities.
Thanks, Ann. Thank you, Mike. So I kind of want to turn things over to our speaker. He's got a wealth of knowledge on this topic. But But Dave, I really want to get your perspective and advice on IPR for our listeners. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience?
Sure. I'm currently a partner at Wiggin and Dana, which is a law firm, and among other things, I do give advice on export compliance and deal with export enforcement matters. And prior to that, I was a federal prosecutor for 23 years and spent a lot of that time working on export control investigations and prosecutions. The best ones were with Mike. And currently, I deal both with clients who are, who are trying to avoid problems with the government by putting together compliance programs and otherwise anticipating issues and making sure that the government's not going to find them in violation of any trade controls. And I also represent clients who have current interactions with the government in which the government is at least questioning whether they were compliant with export regulations.
Got it. Thank you. Well, it's a lot of knowledge, so we're happy you're here to kind of talk us through that. So let's kind of start broadly. In general, what is the responsibility of the trade community in regards to like compliance and due diligence, specifically for imports and exports?
Well, there actually is a great deal of responsibility. I mean, if you're going to participate in international trade, you really need to understand the body of law that regulates international trade. If you're in the United States, certainly you need to understand U.S. laws, but because if you're dealing in international trade, you're also going to need to know about the requirements in the countries where you're engaging in international commerce. With respect to the U.S., in export, for example, I mean, you need to understand whether or not what body of law governs you. I mean, are you dealing in items or technology that's covered by the ITAR, meaning military components, military technology, or are you dealing in dual use items, which are controlled by the Commerce Department under the EAR? And regardless of where, which category you fall into, you always need to be mindful of sanctions. There are multiple, limitations on the ability to trade internationally, for example. And one of the starkest examples is Iran. There's very little trade between the U.S. and Iran that's permitted. And so all that, needs to be taken into account. That means that, companies that are doing international trade need to have rigorous compliance programs. And as I'm always eager to tell my clients, that means more than just having a policy that says you're going to comply with, the law. It means actually having a systematic and rigorous program that includes written policies and procedures, compliance officers who are responsible to make sure the company is in compliance, training programs, and the like.
Okay, that makes sense. And now kind of more into the IPR space, like how would you define what intellectual property actually is? Like what are the measures that companies should have in place related to intellectual property, and which steps need to be taken to protect their products?
Well, the term intellectual property refers generally, I mean, it covers a lot of ground. Generally speaking, it refers to intangible creations and inventions of the human mind, and it can relate, to music and writings, movies. It can also and formulas. Coca-Cola's formula, the formularies for drugs. Anything like that. It also relates to software and sort of digital inventions. And that's, of course, in the current age, extremely important because we're living in a digital age, and many of the functions, tech, even technical, but even mechanical functions that in the past were performed by physical objects are now performed electronically, and all that's driven and governed by software. So a great deal of intellectual property these days involves software and digital inventions. In terms of the legal protections, I mean, anybody who has intellectual property needs to be thinking about securing that, and there are a number of different ways of doing it. In some cases, it's physical. For example, if you're going to if you consider your intellectual property to be a trade secret, you need to keep it secret. So if you have a formula or something like that, you need to, actually I mentioned Coca-Cola before. That's a good example. I mean, their formula for making Coca-Cola is a closely guarded secret, and it's physically secured. I mean, it's very few people know what it is. Other ways of protecting intellectual property include obtaining copyright protection. That's common in terms of software. Software is often protected by copyright, and other protections include trademarks, which are a way of obtaining protection for a unique mark that brands your product, and of course patents for inventions. There are different kinds of patents, but it's those are all sort of categories of legal protection that anybody who owns intellectual property should be thinking about. Not everybody will patent, for example, an invention. Coca-Cola is an example of that. They didn't patent their formula because patents expire. And this takes pretty amazing foresight, but I think Coca-Cola was invented over 100 years ago, and they decided they were going to be in existence for more than the term of a patent, so they just kept it as a trade secret. And but other inventions, I mentioned drugs before. Drugs routinely are patented, and part of the idea there is that they're sort of assuming that after 20 years the drug will probably be overtaken by some new drug. But the fact that the patents expire is what gives us a generics market of drugs that are essentially the same as the initially invented drug. Anyway, there's a lot of different protections. Another thing that anybody with intellectual property, especially software, should be very concerned about is cybersecurity. One way that intangible property like software can be stolen is through hacking a network and and stealing the code, and then cracking it to circumvent any protections that are in place in the code itself. So those are all things that any company with or person with intellectual property should be considering.
Understood. This wasn't a question that I had thought about before, so I'm sorry if I'm throwing you on the spot. It just kind of came up. But in terms of patent data, like, let's say you're a company and you're developing a product, or like, should they consider like a tool to like kind of look into like other patents, make sure that they're not infringing on like something that's already been like patented or copyrighted? That question. You understand like kind of where I'm getting to?
Yeah, no, I understand. And that's I probably should explain. I'm not actually a patent lawyer, but I have partners who are. So I know just enough about patents to to be dangerous. but that what you described is is routinely a part of the process of obtaining a patent. I mean, if you go to a patent lawyer, I mean, one of the things you'll be talking about is, does anybody else, is this, first of all, is this a patentable invention? Second of all, does anybody else already have a patent, for this? And sometimes that can be a subtle question, because you might have an invention that's sort of right next to somebody else's invention, and the question is your invention actually already covered by the other guy's patent? So yes, that very much is an important aspect of counseling in patent law. The same issue can come up with respect to software and copyright protection. You want to obtain copyright protection, but the question is, I mean, but if your software basically overlaps with somebody else's that's already copyrighted, you could be infringing their copyright, which you don't want to do. So yes, that kind of deconfliction is a significant part of that whole enterprise.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and just from a Byte perspective and our product and what we do have a lot of patent data. So obviously, for anyone out there listening, like refer to your lawyer and your attorney. But if there's, if you're interested in looking more into patent data, we do have a lot available like within our app. But kind of to get back to our discussion, like,
can I mention one other thing I forgot to mention? A few minutes ago, you were asking me what you should do to protect your intellectual property. In terms of software, there are technological measures that do protect software from infringement, and anybody who has who's invented a new software program should be thinking about that. I mentioned cracking, and cracking is the process of circumventing those types of technological protections, but a lot of software will come with sort of built-in, protections that are designed to prevent somebody who isn't actually authorized, to use that, who doesn't have a license to use that software. They're designed to, prevent somebody from sort of circumventing those protections and getting into the software itself.
okay, understood. Thank you.
So think about that too.
Good to know. Kind of to bring it all around, Mike earlier discussed like that guilty plea in the case of counterfeit Cisco products. So what are your specific thoughts on that case? And is there anything similar, or are there any similarities to cases that you've prosecuted as a assistant United States attorney?
Yeah, that's a great case study, because it's an interesting case because it sort of has everything. I mean, what they're what they're doing is making counterfeit Cisco networking products, and according to the indictment, they obtained outdated Cisco networking products, and then made them look like current upgraded Cisco products, which they were not. So it was counterfeit. It's interesting that it seems to start with like actual genuine Cisco product, except that they're old and outdated, and they sort of take that as kind of their baseline, and then steal Cisco's technology, including their software, to sort of upgrade the products that they had obtained in order to make them seemingly into something current, like the current Cisco network products. So I mean, it's interesting because all I know is what's in the indictment, and that's pretty general. So what they did was at least analogous to, what many counterfeiters will do, which is to, reverse engineer, obtain a product and then reverse engineer it and then make their own knockoff product of the original product. This, according to the indictment, this is a little bit different from that because they actually obtained, real but old Cisco products and then turned them into, what would have been better products if they'd been real, if they'd been non-counterfeit. I shouldn't say real. They're real. They exist, but they weren't what they purported to be. Now I don't know where they got these products. Apparently, the process of building the counterfeit Cisco products took place in China and Hong Kong. And I do know that Cisco has a sort of has had a difficult relationship with China. I mean, they've been banned from doing business in China. I know this from news reports, no inside information, but that they've had difficulties dealing with China in the past. So I don't know if they obtained these products in China, but Cisco is a global company, and they could have obtained them elsewhere, including in the United States. So it could be that they obtained these things in the U.S. and exported them to China, where they were, I'll say upgraded, but it was sort of it was a counterfeit form of upgrading. And then they took the products and made them look like, in every way, like they were genuine, Cisco products. I mentioned trademark protection before, so they counterfeited Cisco's trademark. They packaged the products to look like they were real Cisco, or genuine authorized Cisco products. And otherwise, fraudulently created the creation that the impression that these were the real deal, real genuine Cisco products. And then they exported them from China to the United States, where they were sold, according to the indictment, at as much as 99% below market value. So, the question comes up frequently, when you see that kind of, that's the kind of discount you see with like stolen and counterfeit products all the time, right? It's, and it's a question. I mean, if anybody's, buying products like Cisco products, and you notice that you're buying something for 99% below market, that should be a red flag that you might not want to buy that product. I mean, it's a good deal in the first instance because you're saving a lot of cash, but these products are often defective because, for a lot of reasons, including the fact that they're not actually being designed to work well. They're just being designed to, to commit fraud. Also, the process, I mentioned that according to the indictment, the software to make it work was stolen, was illegally obtained, and then and presumably, well, actually, it said in the indictment that some of the technological measures designed to protect the software were circumvented, so it was hacked and cracked, and the cracking process can often introduce, and the hacking process too, can introduce flaws into the software and cause the products to degrade or malfunction. So it's not a good idea to buy cracked products for that reason. So to the extent that these things got into the military supply chain, it's very troubling. That can create all kinds of problems for the military. I mean, if they were using a component they thought was from Cisco, but actually was a counterfeit product, it could degrade military networks and cause failures in all kinds of military contexts. So that's actually a big national security problem. You mentioned if this case reminds me of any other cases, and it does. It reminds me. I mean, the whole process of this case. One of the reasons it's a good case study is that it illustrates how you know um, how criminals operate in the context of international trade. It's sort of a good example of illegitimate international trade and the steps that you know um, that criminals will take to bypass different legal requirements and hide what they've done. I mean, that's on display in this case. One of the cases Mike and I worked on was involved a website called Crack 99, where a fellow named Zhang Li, who was physically in China, was selling hacked and cracked software, all kinds of software, and some of it had military applications, and all of it. It was really a massive amount of software, and it was a lot of the software he sold was really, really valuable software. A license would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but he would sell it for $5,000, and much of what was behind Crack 99 was similar to this case in the sense of stealing someone else's technology and then selling it as your own. Zhang Li also engaged in sort of the trademark counterfeiting that you see in this, in the Cisco case. In other words, we had an undercover platform and we bought software from him, and he took a lot of steps to, create, markings on CDs. I guess I'm dating myself. This was back in, when was this? 2010. So you actually bought software on CDs back then, but he would put counterfeit trademarks on it to make it look like it was authentic. And in terms of how these that kind of product can end up in a military or government supply chain, the Crack 99 case sort of showed how that works too. It's you're not going to expect a government officer, procurement officer, to kind of go to Crack 99 and buy, software that has a military application. Usually, the way it actually gets into the supply chain is going to be through some other supplier or vendor or a subcontractor who is trying to save money and finds a way to buy cheaper software, and then that gets introduced in the supply chain. We had one customer of Crack 99 we prosecuted who worked for a defense contractor who was involved in developing radar for Marine One, which is the Marine Corps squadron that flies the president around in helicopters. You've heard of Air Force One. That's the big 747 that the president flies around. Marine One refers to the helicopters that ferry the president around shorter distances. So that's troubling. That cracked software that could have been flawed finds its way into the process of developing, radar for the president's helicopter. Another customer we prosecuted, Crack 99 customer we prosecuted, was employed at NASA, and he had a sort of side business where he was obtaining, software from Crack 99. So it sort of filters in, through the whole network of people and companies that are part of, the military procurement system. So anyway, I hope I answered your questions. I said a lot of words anyway.
I think you did. I get think it's very interesting and super helpful to understand. I mean, I think that's all we kind of wanted to cover today. But before we do our thank yous and close out, like, is there anything else that you or Mike would suggest, like our listeners or anyone in import or export, kind of do, or just advice that you have for them to increase their due diligence and their personal responsibility before we close out?
Well, I mean, one is look for these red flags. If the deal seems like it's too good to be true, it probably is. There are a lot of people out there selling pirated products. I mean, Crack 99 is by no means the only website that was selling hacked and cracked products. I mean, you can go online and you find any number of websites who are doing the same thing. I mean, I had a I would hope the government would be doing that, but they're not. I wish they were. There's the government could be doing a lot more to limit the reach of software pirates like Zhang Li. But in the absence of effective government enforcement, it's really up to individuals and companies to be mindful of the fact that that's out there, and to avoid transacting in those kinds of transactions. I don't know the people who bought these counterfeit Cisco products. I don't know what they were thinking, but I'm gonna guess that they just thought this is just a great deal. And I just think you need to think twice when you see a deal like that. Same thing goes for cars and jewelry. If somebody's going to sell you a really hot car for a couple $1,000, you ought to be suspicious of that transaction. And the other thing is, it's important for companies to protect their intellectual property. I mean, to do things to prevent theft of their software. It's an ongoing issue, and it's not easy, but I do think it's an important one. Mike, I want to give you a chance to say something.
Dave, I think you summarized that perfectly. And it's just to go back to that point, you have to be mindful of who you're purchasing from. You have to use reasonable care standard when you're importing into the U.S. You need to understand who your customers are and understand your products, and it's all part of due diligence and your compliance program.
Definitely. Well, thank you again so much for your time today, Dave. We really appreciate you jumping on with us today and talking about this topic, and also for all the work that you've done in the United States Attorney's Office and as a private partner. Thank you to Mike and Ann as well. If anyone listening is interested in a demo of Byte, feel free to reach out to us anytime. You can find us on our website at bytedata.io, or you can send us an email at byte@newborders.com. We do offer a 5-day free trial of the app that you can sign up for at app.bytedata.io. But yes, thank you all again, and hope to talk soon.